I'm about to do another album called Where You Been Shouted. Where you been shouted all your life, where you been shouted. Where you been shouted all your life, shouted. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted in the hood. Where you been shouted. College Park. Where you been shouted. East Point. Where you been shouted. East Lake. Where you been shouted. In the library. Where you been shouted. In the club. Where you been shouted. In the jail. Where you been shouted. In the prison. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted. On MLK shouted. Where you been shouted. All your life shouted. Where you been shouted. In Africa. Where you been shouted. In Jamaica. Where you been shouted. Oakland City. Where you been shouted. Country Road. Where you been shouted. New York. Where you been shouted. In Alabama. Where you been shouted. In Texas. Where you been shouted. In Florida. Where you been shouted. All your life shouted. Where you been shouted. On Country Road shouted. Where you been shouted. Central Road shouted. Where you been shouted. Vine City shouted. Where you been shouted. In Cabbage Town shouted. Where you been shouted. In the church shouted. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted. Around the world shouted. Where you been shouted. Around the world shouted. Where you been shouted. Around the world shouted. Where you been shouted. At the candy lady. Where you been shouted. At the gas station. Where you been shouted. All your life shouted. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted. In the private shouted. Where you been shouted. Where you been shouted. All your life shouted. Pop, pop, pop. I'm rapping again. Pop, pop, pop. Where you been? Where you been? Where you been shouted? Where you been shouted? Where you been shouted? Paramount, where you been shouted? And Fairview, where you been shouted? Westlake, where you been shouted? West End, where you been shouted? And MLK shouted, where you been shouted? Mississippi shouted, where you been shouted? And New Orleans shouted, where you been shouted? Chicago shouted, where you been shouted? In Tennessee, I love y'all, we're representing. Where you been all your life? Around the world shouted, Bankhead.